talking about dependence, one thing we could say that a lot of the nations, a lot of people, an issue that they are facing, nations like Australia and some African nations, one of the issues that they're facing is they have what you may call, or what I may call, a dependence mindset. Let's say, for instance, a nation like Australia, one of the problems we're having is we depend too much on foreigners. We depend too much on foreigners like America. Other nations, we depend too much on other nations like America, nations like China, to provide and to supply our goods and services. Now, the issue with that is, because it depends so much on all these other nations, when these nations start to face a lot of problems, when a lot of things starts happening in all these nations, it also affects Australia itself. If, for instance, anything happens to China, for instance, it's going to affect a lot of the jobs in Australia here. But one thing we have to understand is, we shouldn't depend too much on all these nations, because as Australian, we have potentials. We also have the resources that we need to build this nation. We shouldn't keep on depending on all these nations. Africa also, we depend on foreigners. The problem we have is we depend on them to come to our own nation and to build our own nation for us. We trust them too much. And that's why a lot of people in Africa, they prefer to travel to different countries, developing countries, because they see the other people's country better than their own country. And so the thing is that depending on all these nations, again, the problem is, a lot of us don't really understand that we also have the resources in our own country to develop our own country. We have the potentials. The youths in these countries have the potential. And the thing is, we have to develop these youths. We have to discover these youths. But it's actually difficult for us to do that, because a lot of these youths, they're struggling with drugs, they're struggling with alcohol, they're struggling with gang issues and all that stuff. So how can we actually bring the best out of these youths? And it's happening here in Australia too. A lot of kids are struggling with things like suicide, things like depression, things like anxiety, alcohol, all these addictions. We have to start being productive as a nation. We have to start coming up with new ways of using our resources. One thing that shocked me is that, for instance, take Africa, for instance, right? If you look at Africa, how many car companies do you think they own? How many car companies do you think has been produced by an African company that you could say this is made in Africa? From generation to generation, history throughout history, I'm still waiting to see a car that has been produced by an African person, that is sold in Western world, that is sold in developing nations. The entire Africa has not, you could say, produced one or two cars. But yet a man himself called Elon Musk, this one guy, he just came out of nowhere and he has produced a car called Tesla. He owns aircrafts, he owns all these things. How come the Africa itself has not produced one car, yet one man is doing it? Have we really thought about that? Because we're still depending on West, we're still depending on other people. We depend on them to provide us cars. We depend on them to come to our nation to do all these things for us. There's what they call, someone said, give me a fish and you'll feed me for a day. But teach me to fish and that will feed me for a year, lifetime. What we do is we depend on these nations to come and give us fish, to keep on providing us fish, to keep on giving us all these things. But yet again, when the issue is, when they give us these things, when they come to our nation and build houses for us, when they come to our nations and supply us cars, water and all that stuff, when we face natural disasters, when there is war, all these things are destroyed, we have to depend on all these nations again. We have to call them back to come and help us again. But the thing is, it's not bad to receive support from these nations, but if they can come to our nation, and if they can teach us how to make cars, if they can teach us how to build houses, if they can teach us how to, make water resources, agriculture, all these things, how to preserve our food, then when disasters come, when all these things come, when war come, we won't need to depend on them, because we already have in our mind. We already have the ideas. We already know how to do it by ourselves. The problem we're having nowadays is the dependency mindset.